My author is Charles W. Chesnutt. Some background information on Charles W. Chesnutt was he was born in Cleveland, Ohio in 1858. He was the son of free black immigrants from the South. He grew up in Fayetteville, North Carolina during the turbulent Reconstruction era. How Chesnutt got into writing. He was a quiet, bookish boy and attended school regularly. In his late teens, he was an assistant principal of the normal school established for blacks in Fayetteville. He married in 1878, and his impatience with the restrictions of life in the South fueled him to find better opportunities. With a plan to move to the North to strike for entering wedge in the literary world, he moved to New York City in 1883 and to Cleveland in 1884, where he settled for his family, passed the Ohio State Bar, and launched a business career as a legal stenographer, which is a person whose job is to transcribe speech in shorthand. Highlights of Chesnutt's life. He was the first African-American writer of fiction to enlist the white-controlled publishing industry in the service of his social method. From 1899 to 1905, he published 2 short stories and 3 novels, and then in 1928, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People awarded him its Spingarn Medal for his pioneer works as a literary artist depicting the life and struggles of Americans of African-American descent, and for his long and useful career as a scholar, worker, and freeman of one of America's greatest cities. So historians of African-American writing today recognize Chesnutt for almost single-handedly starting truly African-American literary tradition in the short stories. The Conjurer Woman. This was a series of short stories, and every one of the stories included John, who was a white male from the North who had moved to the American South because his wife was unhealthy. He retells the story he has heard from Uncle Julius, a former slave, who tells John conjure tales. The 2 short articles that I'll talk about that were in this short series was The Gooford Grapevine and David's Necklace. The Conjurer Woman theme was slavery as capitalism. Capitalists produce goods and services without trying to hurt their profits, so this is what they used the slaves for. The Gooford Grapevine was originally published in the Atlantic Monthly in August 1887. It was his first important work of fiction. It was also part of The Conjure Woman. So this story was that he took his wife from Cleveland, Ohio to Patesville, North Carolina. He went to see a plantation for sale, and he took his wife Annie to see it and encountered Julius McAdoo, and he told him, or Uncle Julius, and he told him the story of the farm. To protect his crops, the master McAdoo consulted with Aunt Peggy, who was a conjure woman whose spells scared the free black and slaves. The grapes were bewitched, and anyone who stole them would die in a year. So Henry was a new slave that they bought, and when the other people went away to go do work for the day, Henry ate some of the grapes, not knowing that they were bewitched. And when the master found out, he took him to Aunt Peggy to get rid of the bewitchment that was on him because he ate these grapes. And she fixed him, but told him to come back in the spring to get fixed again. So when the vines sprouted, Henry's hair grew. And then in summer, his hair was curly and his arthritis disappeared, making him really strong and one of the best slaves that they had. And then in winter or fall, his hair fell straight again and the leaves fell, so did his. And then the master sold Henry for $15,000 in the spring and bought him back for $500 in the winter, and did this for 5 years to make a lot of money to buy a second plantation. And then a Yankee stranger, which is a northern stranger, claimed to the master that he was an expert in grape plantation. And so the master agreed to let him work. And so he dug up the soil around the vines and said that everything should be good. And then that spring, the vines and the leaves shriveled up and the grapes. And when the big vine died, so did Henry. It took 7 years to reestablish the vineyard, and then when Civil War came, McAdoo raised a company of men to kill the Northerners because he was so angry at them for killing Henry and his plantation, but this got himself killed. Then the vineyard was abandoned when the South surrendered, and it turns out that Julius had been living in a cabin by the old plantation and selling the wild scuppernongs, which is why he advised them not to buy the vineyard, but he assured us that Julius makes more than he did before. The theme of this story was regionalism, a realist theory movement. He attempts to realistically present specific settings, language, characters, and beliefs to entertain a national audience that's curious about the culture of the South. It's also a Black folk hero and has a lot of racial themes in it. So David's Necklace was originally published in the Atlantic Monthly in 1889. It was part of The Conjure Woman. In this story, Uncle Julius tells a story about slavery days to John and Annie when he's invited to dinner. While Julius is eating ham, he starts to tear up. Julius tells the story about Dave, and Dave had learned to read a Bible, and when he got caught, he said that he wasn't in any wrong and that it was teaching him not to steal, and so he agreed to let him preach the Bible to the slaves. And then this girl, Disley, comes along, and Dave falls for her. And Willie was someone who came from where Disley came from in a plantation. And so Willie gets mad, and he frames Dave for stealing a ham. And then once Dave got caught for stealing a ham, he was sentenced to 40 lashes, and he had to wear a ham around his neck that was tied to a chain. And then he had to go in front of all the other slave workers, and they were saying if he was guilty or not, and everyone said he was guilty, even Disley. But then Julius was the only one who thought that he wasn't guilty, and Dave confided in Julius that he thought that he was turning into a ham. Then later on, Willie was exposed as a chicken thief, and he suffered a wound from a gunshot. Then he admits that he framed Dave for stealing a turkey, and when they go to find Dave to let him know that they found out the truth, they saw Dave had hung himself in the smoke shop. And then after Julius tells his story, then Annie, the wife, goes to give ham to Julius because she felt bad and thought that they shouldn't take it from him. The themes in this is the dehumanization of slavery. Not only did Dave believe he was a ham, but he became the meat which humans consume by hanging himself in the smokehouse. The wife of his youth. This is another series of short stories and was about proclamation of death in the plantation myth of the Black man as defined, and appealed primarily to white readers. So this story was about Mr. Ryder, a light-skinned Black man born free before the Civil War. He was the head of the Blue Vein Society, a club for educated and cultured Black people who were all light-skinned too. They all believed that they were mainly white. And then Molly Dixon comes along, and Mr. Ryder meets her and wants to propose to her. He thought that she was the only man that he could ever marry. And so he plans the next Blue Veins ball, and then that's when he would propose to her. But then Liza Jane, an older Black woman, comes to ask him for help and tells him that she was a slave and married a younger man, Sam, who was free before the Civil War. He was sold into slavery, and Liza helped him escape. She spent the next 25 years looking for Sam after the war. But Mr. Ryder suggested that Sam could have remarried, died, or just didn't want her to look for him anymore. He didn't want to look for her anymore. So then at the ball, Ryder gives a speech, and he tells a story of Liza, and all the guests agreed that Sam should acknowledge his wife. Mr. Ryder then leaves and returns with Liza and introduces her as the wife of the youth. The themes of this is race and class. The elite Black people of the North are not white, but they wish to be, and look down on the poorer and Blacker members of the community. By doing this, they ignore their past and real identity. Another theme is identity. Mr. Ryder was a successful, influential, and cultured, and he had a position of power. He sees himself closer to the white race than the black. Liza Jane, however, makes him remember who he was and where he came from. The next story is The Passing of the Grandson. And this is a story within the wife of his youth. And in this story, Dick Owens, which is a young rich man attending a trial of a Yankee, the Northerns, who had been tried with the kidnapping of a slave from his master. In prison, he dies of helping treat his fellow inmates and is deemed a hero by Charity Lomax. And this is ironic because Charity originally wouldn't marry him because he wasn't heroic. And when she told him this, it inspired Dick Owens to steal one of his father's slaves and set him free in Canada because there was no slavery there. So his father presents him with someone and he didn't trust him, so he didn't take him. So then he offers grandson, and Dick takes grandson and gives him freedom, but grandson won't leave him, and so he had him kidnapped. Dick tells Charity about this story when he gets back, and then she falls in love with him. They get married. Then grandson comes back weeks later and is allowed to marry Betty. And then shortly after this, grandson Betty and his family escape to Canada. Some themes of this story is white superiority and black inferiority. Dick Owens believes that grandson would rather be a slave than be free and doesn't realize that grandson was faking the whole thing. And the next theme is passing. Grandson masked his identity and played along with being the perfect slave, thus allowing him to pass on to his new life of freedom. Some relevant themes and styles of writing is realism within this whole book. So realism is the way of representing a person or situation in a way that is true to life. And I think that Chesnutt did this very well with talking about all the stories of the slaves and how the white people saw them and the differences between everyone. And then the next one is a framing device, which leads readers from a first story into one or more other stories within it. Chesnutt also doesn't pool the story together until the very end, which allows the readers to be drawn into the story and fully understand by the end.